for joining today and being here. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And today we're going to be joined by co-founder and CTO of Blocknative, Chris Meisl. My name is Laurence, and I'm a product marketer at Blocknative. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So a little bit about Chris. Throughout Chris's career, he's worked with real-time data for ad tech, Spotify, and Apple, to name a few. Chris even worked at NASA, where he was involved in deep space probes dealing with real-time data. And today, Chris is focused on real-time data in the blockchain ecosystem, specifically in the pre-chain layer, as it involves block building and relays. So as you can imagine, he has intimate experience with every aspect of building blocks and the particularities surrounding each second involved. I know this is going to be a really good one. And a little bit about Blocknative. Our real-time infrastructure enables validators, searchers, and traders to optimize staking rewards and trading profit. Our mempool explorer, if you haven't checked it out yet, is free to use, and we highly encourage you to set up an account so you can monitor the mempool in real time. Blocknative is also a leading Ethereum block builder and relay provider. Throughout Chris's presentation, feel free to add any questions to the Q&A section, and if we have time, we will answer them at the end. Without further ado, let's jump in, Chris.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much, Laurence. We'll dive right in. I'm going to go slightly faster since we had a slight delay. We're going to be talking about slots here and what goes on inside of a slot, but in order to get there, we need to talk about consensus and what transaction finality means. So there's going to be this little journey that we take today that will eventually get us to the details of a slot, and more importantly, how slots actually play out in the real world, especially from the experience that we have at Blocknative, operating both builders and relays and a relay, so we can actually see what sort of the dynamics is there. So just to sort of jump in, and there's sort of a wide variety of experience levels of people that are tuning in. So I'm going to sort of start with some very sort of general material, and then get into the details. So just as a quick reminder, the Ethereum now is essentially two chains. You have the beacon chain, which represents the consensus layer. That's what all the validators run, and then of course you have the execution layer, which is running good old Geth in order to get blocks. And we're going to be focusing mostly on the consensus layer here, because it's all about what the validators are doing to get consensus on slots. And but there is some overlap that's pretty interesting with the execution layer, because that's where the value is. That's where it is the block that has the value, and it is that value, whether it is normally through public mempool or through MEV. That's the value that the validators are receiving by validating the block. So on the consensus layer, there's a lot of moving parts. There's validators, and a subset of those are proposers. A subset of validators are part of a committee at any given time. There's epics and slots, and you have these sort of external pieces like relays and builders and mev boost. It's just there's a lot of moving parts. We're going to be touching on pretty much all of these and how they kind of work together. So let's break this down and dive right in. So the goal, of course, of the consensus layer is to get transaction finality. And that is, the definition of finality means that transaction can no longer be changed. And of course, because it's a blockchain, transactions come in groups called blocks. And so what that means is that the block can't be changed. And this is actually a big difference from what we've had in the past. So under proof of work, there was no real sense of sort of strong finality. There was this idea: you're confirmed, you're on chain, and the farther the more blocks that have been built on top of the block that contains your transaction, then the more secure you can feel that transaction is not going to be reverted or changed somehow through some kind of reorg or fork in the chain. And so a lot of applications basically would wait for maybe 5 blocks or 10 blocks before they actually reported to their user that it was confirmed, because of this sort of possibility of reorgs. And reorgs were happening sort of all the time. We have uncles, we have these sort of mini reorgs, if you will, and then more significant ones that were multi-block reorgs that would actually kind of change the state. So confirmed it was sort of a weak confirmation that then got stronger as time went by. And of course, time under proof of work, there was no real sense of time. There was just block number, because the time it takes to create a new block is highly variable. It could be 1 second, it could be 50 seconds. It would average to maybe 12 or 13 or 14 seconds, but any individual block could be in a wide range. Now, under proof of stake, this introduces this idea of what's called a safe head or a justified block. And then if you go a little bit farther back, there's sort of a finalized block. And a finalized block is one that really can't be reverted. Now, can't be reverted, that's a strong statement. I don't really mean absolutely can't be reverted. What I mean by that is that the cost of that reversion would be so extreme that for all practical purposes, you can say that it won't happen. In the case of Ethereum under proof of stake, the cost of that reversion is going to be 1/3 of the total stake in Ethereum, which is many, many, many billions of dollars at this point, and growing. So there's a much now stronger sense of an actual state where you can say, hey, this is not going to change, and you can build additional business value or logic on top of the fact that that's not going to revert in any way. And of course, the other thing that has changed with proof of stake is that now there is an actual clock. So every slot occurs every 12 seconds. So every 6.4 minutes, you have a new epoch, and we'll get into the details of that. There's an actual clock. So today, with proof of stake on Ethereum, now we can very confidently say that a block has been finalized and is not going to change, and you can base a lot of your business logic on that after 2 epochs have gone by. So that's about 13 minutes, sorry. Okay, so let's get into some of these terms here. So what's an epoch and what's a slot? So a slot occurs every 12 seconds. An actual 12 seconds, not an approximate, not an average, but actually 12 seconds. You can actually compute the slot number from the time, and you can compute the time from the slot number, or the range. And a slot basically is an opportunity for there to be a block in the chain. Doesn't mean that every slot contains a block, but it can. Now, most blocks contain slots contain a block, but it's not required. So there's this concept of a missed slot that is basically empty. So that can happen. And then you roll up 32 slots into an epoch. And so an epoch is 32 times 12 seconds, so 6.4 minutes. And those are sort of the basic units that's used by the system to sort of determine the level of finality of transactions. Okay, so let's dive in. So under proof of stake, you basically have these epochs, as I mentioned before. Each of them contain 32 slots. And then as you move forward in time, you have validators that are proposing a block, but we're going to skip that for now. More importantly, you have validators that are attesting to the block that was proposed for a particular slot. And as those attestations come in, when they reach a certain level, then you consider that block to be what's called justified. And then if it's far enough back in time now, so it's 2 epochs ago, then you get to a finalized state. And that's the point at which the amount of ETH required in order to overcome that is so high that we can consider it, extremely safe at that point. So let's actually walk through sort of this timeline. So you have the, at the beginning of every epoch, the first slot is sort of special, and that's kind of called like a checkpoint slot. And that one is used to basically say that the previous one is now, in a sort of locked in state. So if it's the previous slot, then the previous epoch, then that first slot is saying that the prior epoch to that is now finalized. And the epoch that this slot is in, slot 64 in this case, is considered justified. So you can see that the epoch 1 is actually listed as finalized, but it's only the first slot that's finalized in there. That's just sort of the way we kind of use the nomenclature there. And at that point, So validators then vote for these sort of pairs of checkpoints, sort of the previous, the n-1 epoch. So n in this case is epoch 3, the n-1 epoch, epoch 2, and the checkpoint for the n-2 epoch. And as long as 2/3 of the validators are sort of honest and put their stake against that, then that basically upgrades those slots to the sort of justified and finalized state. And then that takes the previous epoch, now epoch 0, to be fully finalized and non-revertible, if you will. And this is just to say that the previous epoch, gets into the sort of justified state, which is like think of it like it's like a precursor to being finalized. And a lot of applications actually use the justified state as strong enough indicator that nothing's going to happen. It's actually pretty hard to undo the justified state, but not as strong as a finalized state. And then of course the finalized state for the n-2 block at that point. So the goal of this is to get to that finalized state. Now, what's actually going on here, sort of technically, is there's two components to the consensus algorithm, if you will. There is the sort of the Casper, the friendly finality gadget, and that is the sort of overlay that makes these decisions based on the validator weight. So it's not the number. Don't think of it in terms of the number of validators. Think about it as the validator weight, because each validator sort of represents a certain amount of stake. And so you take the aggregate stake of all of the validators that are attesting to a particular slot and a particular epoch. And then once that sort of achieves that sort of 2/3 rate, then you can feel like you're in a safe space. And there's very sort of detailed rules inside of Casper that add some weights in different configurations in order to make this thing very, very efficient. But it's this Casper overlay that really sort of drives the understanding or the setting of whether it is justified or finalized. So that's really tied to the attestation. And then the other part of the consensus algorithm is LMD Ghost. And Ghost is basically just a fork choice rule. There's a few other things, but primarily it's a fork choice rule. And that's designed to just keep this timeline that you see moving forward so that you keep building blocks. And so there's sort of a trade-off that you do in proof of stake between liveness, which is you keep building blocks. It doesn't stop, it doesn't halt, the chain doesn't halt. And that's what Ghost does, is it makes sure that you're always building blocks. Now, those blocks may not be justified or finalized. Those blocks may not have the attestations you need in order to feel comfortable that everything is operating nicely and smoothly, but you are continuing to build blocks. And then the Casper side is adding the safety on top of the liveness. So, and liveness and safety are kind of, they have some sort of countervailing forces. So you have to kind of balance those out, right? So Casper is basically trying to give you the safety, which is sort of the colors here. And then Ghost is giving you the steady live progression of blocks, which is the slots here. Okay. Yeah, and then this just sort of is a reminder that if you wanted to revert a finalized block on a finalized slot, if you will, then you would have to burn 1/3 of the total staked ETH of the entire network. And I do see a question from Isa on what may lead to a missed slot, and I'm actually going to answer that a little bit later in this presentation. I'll have a diagram about that, so we'll get there. Okay, and just a quick reminder that not all validators are voting or attesting for every slot, every epoch. That committees are formed and using this Randau function. So that it's sort of randomized across the network, and those committees then, for every slot, one validator is sort of anointed to be the proposer for that. And that's the validator that gets to propose the block that is going to be associated with the slot. And as the proposer, that validator also is the one that gets the reward, assuming that the block is valid and and behaves properly, so all the attestations come through okay. But then there's 127 other validators that are going to be in the committee that make sure that that all the slots in that epoch have all the right attestations. So, and I bring this up partly because, if we have time at the end and briefly talk about single slot finality, then this changes there, because you basically approach it differently than these small committees. But these small committees that are primarily done in order to make the system much more efficient and fast. All right, so now we get to the slot. So that was sort of the background material to sort of build up to what's actually happening inside of the slot. So the slot has 3 phases, each that are approximately 4 seconds long. So the first part is where a block is propagated within the slot. And then the next part is where attestations start to happen. And attestations are a little bit on the heavy side. There's just a lot of message, a lot of bytes that have to be moved around for that. But that's basically the voting that goes on. And then a subset of the committee of the validators involved in this particular epoch and all the slots within that epoch are going to then aggregate the attestations. So attestations use BLS signatures, and BLS signatures, they're a little bit computationally intensive. They can be, but they have a really cool feature, which is you can aggregate them. You can combine a bunch of them, and the verification of the group verifies all the ones that are inside of it. So it has this aggregation feature. And so the last third of the phase of the 12 seconds of a slot is where all that aggregation happens, and those aggregated attestations then are attached to the next proposed block that basically attests to this block. So that's sort of the sequence that happens. That's sort of the design. Call this the concept. This is what's supposed to happen. Let's talk about what actually happens. And this is a very much a simplification, but it gets to sort of the guts of what's actually happening every 12 seconds on Ethereum today. So you have at the beginning of the slot, builders. So this is under PBS or proposer builder separation. So now you have the builders are separate from the proposers. The proposer is the validator, and the builder basically is building a block. It can be the validator, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the validator. And typically blocks are being built with a lot of MEV in them, with maximal extractable value in them. That makes the blocks much more valuable, and more, hundreds of percent more valuable, like 300% more value. I can't remember the exact number. And so those are preferred blocks. So these builders, they have relationships with searchers, which are entities that basically are looking for opportunities to find MEV. That MEV could be sort of atomic MEV. That's you detect a transaction in the public mempool, and then you back run it or front run it or sandwich it or do something to extract value out of it. But there's also a lot of MEV that is, like between a centralized exchange and a decentralized exchange. So they're, these searchers are working with price oracles on Binance and things like that. There's all kinds of different ways to do that. There's long tail MEV that is, buy now, sell a lot later, because you're watching social media very carefully and understand that this thing is going to go up in value, and you have some kind of way of detecting when something is going to become available, and you take advantage of that. So there's all kinds of different MEV, and builders will work with searchers that basically construct bundles, which are combinations, one or more transactions that are essentially private transactions that may include public transactions. These searchers send those to the builders. The builder plays this game, of course, of trying to find the optimal combination that makes the most valuable block. And that's the block that then they will submit to a relay. So starting at the beginning of the slot, they're basically building and start submitting to relays. So this is where you're sending to a relay. And then so throughout this period, you're sending to a relay, and I will give you a very good visual of how this actually plays out after this. And then at some point, the proposer, so that's the validator that has now been anointed for the current slot to be able to propose a block. The proposer is going to request for basically the highest block bid from the relays that it is connected to. So that validator is using MEV-Boost, and which basically is like a proxy that talks to whichever relays the validator wants it to talk to. And it handles sort of it's like a very simple auction mechanism where it when asked for a bid, it goes and asks for bid from all of the relays, and then returns back to the proposer the highest bid. It's basically that simple. So the proposer will better careful moving my mouse here. The proposer will request the bid, and then MEV-Boost will then ask all of the relays to get that bid. We call it a get header request, and then it will send that request back, the result of that, the most profitable block, back to MEV-Boost, and then the proposer will commit to that block by calling get payload. And get payload is an action by the proposer where they are signing their commitment to the header in order to get the payload. So that way they don't get to see the payload until they've committed to actually proposing that payload, because the header contains the hash, the block hash, and the block hash is deterministic from, it's determined by the contents of the block. So if you change the contents of the block, the hash would change, and therefore you, by committing to that hash, you've committed to the block. And this is a way for the relays, the builders, the relays to be able to deliver blocks that have high value to the proposer without the proposer, in theory, being able to sort of mess with the block. Like, for example, change some of the transactions so that more value goes to the proposer. So it's sort of a safe system. And once they have then committed to that, then the relay will release the block to the proposer. The proposer then receives that block and then proposes it. Basically pushes it out onto the network, propagates it out onto the network. And meanwhile, the relay also proposed it just to sort of help things along. And in fact, there's been a recent change where any relay that knew about this block, remember that builders might send to multiple relays. And let's say that, the winning block is coming from the Blocknative relay, then not only will the Blocknative relay propagate that block once it's signed, the proposer will also should also propagate that block if it's signed. But if any other relay also happen to have that block because they work with the same builder, then they will also propagate that block. They will get that signal. So the idea here is to get block propagation going as fast as possible. There's a very good reason for that, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And then once that proposed block is starting to propagate, then of course, all the other validators that are part of the committee for the current epoch can start to do their attestations, and then those attestations get aggregated, et cetera, et cetera. So this is sort of the sequence, and I don't know if it's clear in this diagram, but there's something very different about this diagram and this diagram, and which is that this one goes from t equals 0 to t equals 12 seconds. This one is actually going from t equals 0 to t equals 16, and you will see that all of the activity, almost all of the interesting activity, is actually happening after the end of the slot. It is for the block of the slot represented by the first 12 seconds here, but it's all sort of happening pretty sort of late in the game, right? So that's the first 4 seconds in this block propagation. And this is super important because what's typically happening is that block propagation doesn't occur at t equals 0. It's occurring often much closer to t equals 4. And that shrinks the timeline for all of the attestations to come in. And that is a key factor in why there might be missed blocks. Because if you wait too long as a proposer, and then you might your block may not propagate fast enough to the other members of the committee, and therefore they might say, oh, well, I don't have a block, so the current head is the previous block, and so now you have a missed slot. So that's sort of a common, not common, but a very possible scenario. And this is sort of driven by the fact that value in blocks is pretty much always going up. And so it's in the interest of the proposer to wait as long as possible, but the longer they wait, then the more they risk getting absolutely nothing, because they then miss the slot because they waited too long. Okay, so what does a relay actually see? This is where it gets kind of interesting, because a relay is in this very interesting trusted position between the builders and the validators. So what the validator gets is what the relay sees, the aggregate of all the relays that a particular validator is looking at. So let's take a look at that. So this is an interesting chart that was done by Metrica, and I have misspelled their name in the source. I apologize to Metrica for that. It's a K, not a C. And they did an analysis across all of the major relays, and this shows sort of some of the behavior that we see, which is that at the start of the slot, you'll see that blocks are being built. And so this is relays reporting, because that's all done in the open, that blocks are available, not the contents of the block, just the headers and the bids. And so you can see that block building starts pretty early in the slot. So remember, this is like the previous slot for the slot that is now going to have that block in it. That's why it has negative times. And then as you get close towards the end, then block building really kicks in, because that's when all the value is getting really good. And so relays are making a huge number of blocks available. And then the actual block proposals are all happening sort of near that boundary, right? So there's a bunch that are happening before the end of the slot. So that's before t equals 0. Those are sort of safe proposals that you want to make sure that the propagation happens, and so you don't miss out on the slot. But there's also a lot of actors that are going to be waiting until very late. So you can see people are like 2.5 seconds in. There's still a few people that are waiting to propose until then, and really taking their chances with propagation delays. So that's kind of the general distribution of block availability over time relative to that slot boundary. You can call it the T0 or the T12, whichever your preference is. All right, so what the relay actually sees now is, this is for a given slot, is that at the beginning, you have these bids coming in. So this is showing you the color represents the builder, and then the height on the vertical scale represents the value of the bid, the value of the block. And so there's just a few, there's some builder that's constantly building and sending it to relays. But then about halfway through the slot, things start to get interesting, where a lot more builders start to kick in. And this is sort of typical behavior that we see operating the Blocknative relay. It's actually behavior that we use in our own builder, which is don't bother building until halfway into the slot, because it's just kind of a waste of time. And that's not going to be a block that is going to be accepted. And so as you get towards the end of the slot, then building activity really kicks into high gear, and you see some striation here. That's sort of incremental improvements to a block, and then some big MEV opportunity shows up, and then you'll jump up to the next level and the next level. And not all builders see everything from every searcher. Different builders have access to different searchers. So that's why some of like this orangish one here didn't have access to some interesting opportunities. Now, you might think that you look at the very highest dot, maybe that's this little sort of teal turquoise colored one. That's not necessarily the block that wins, because it depends on when the proposer actually says, okay, I'm ready to propose, give me a block. And that might be here, it might be earlier, it could be anywhere sort of in these last few seconds. So the actual winning block is not necessarily the most valuable block. it was the most valuable block at the time that the proposer was ready to sign a block. And that's kind of interesting because that's shown here also by Metrica that this is the proposed blocks. This is basically the same as what I showed earlier in the previous Metrica diagram. But the distribution of the highest block rewards, the highest bids, is actually offset from that to the right. And so if proposers waited longer in order to get the higher bids, then they would actually be more profitable purely from a bid perspective. But of course, they're now taking a chance on latency that that their block won't propagate in time for the attestation to complete sufficiently in order to to fill the slot. So this is sort of the game that a validator has to do in order to sort of, it's kind of like a bird in the hand versus two in the bush kind of a thing. Do you want to take the value X, or do you want to take value X plus whatever, but that has higher risk? And this is why some validators will operate with some pretty fancy networking stacks in order to push the boundaries so they can get more into this sort of highest block reward regime than be near the beginning, the beginning of the slot. Okay, so before I continue with the deck, I wanted to just go live real quick with some of what we talked about here. So this is a recent slide. This was like an hour ago. Actually, I can probably, if I don't mess anything up, I'll just go to current block, near the current block, and let that load. It's actually computing all of the bids by querying all of the relays. And once this populates, which hopefully will be soon, then you will see that for that particular block, what all the relays reporting and what all of the builders were doing. And usually this happens a fair bit faster than this. And of course, now that it is live, it doesn't. So yeah, so that's unfortunate. Maybe that'll, I'll come back to that if that fills in. A little quick refresh here. There we go. All right, so this is what just happened. This was not too long, a few seconds ago. So, this is it's free real estate is this builder, and you can see what it was doing. And here's another builder that is, this is the Flashbots SGX builder doing its thing. But then when things really start to kick in, that's when you get to, there's the Titan builder, another Flashbots builder. Here's a Blocknative builder, and the rsync builder. Yeah. Anyway, so then things got super duper competitive here. And then somewhere around here probably is where the winning block was chosen. And it continued to go up. And that was that Metrica chart that I showed earlier, which is that there's more value, but it's too risky to go for that value because of the latency concerns that you have in actually getting that sort of proposed. So you can see that these jumps usually mean that some transaction occurred in the public mempool that had a lot of MEV in it, and searchers jumped on it, and so builders then picked it up and they leapt up to that new state. You can see that most of the builders do that because there's a lot of overlap of the builders with the searchers in terms of searchers tend to send it to most of the major builders. But sometimes you'll see that there's very few builders that'll make a leap, and that's often because the leap was due to a price oracle change, and so it's more of a sexdex arbitrage opportunity, and relatively fewer builders might engage in that because that's essentially what's called a two-legged transaction. So there's a certain amount of risk, you need a certain amount of capital, and that's more the domain for what we call searcher builders, which are builders that do their own searching because they can take advantage of that better. Okay, so going back then to the I should actually show that on if you go to Beacon Chain, they have this sort of slot visualization, so you can kind of see what I was talking about earlier. Is each of these is an epoch, and so this is the current epoch that is being populated. And these are each slot coming in. And green means that it was a successful proposal. That means there was good attestation for it. Red would mean that it was missed. And then if it's green all the way across, then that's basically, you know, an epic with all slots that were that were filled. And if you see any red, then there'll be a slot that was missed in that. And then you can see here that this is the current one that's happening. So these are justified. And then if you go back n minus 2, it's n minus 2 against the most filled block, the complete epic. Those are now finalized. And these percentages are showing sort of the value of stake, that is the weight of justification or finalization behind that. So this is sort of really strong. What's interesting here is this could be a very, very low number and it still works. And that's why there's this separation of Casper and Ghost, is that Ghost makes sure that this progression continues happening no matter what. And Casper is trying to get it to be, you know, high percentages, so that you can really trust it. And one of the things that we saw during the Chapella upgrade, which was the most recent hard fork, especially on Goerli, testnet, we saw very low percentages here, which was sort of expected because not everyone had upgraded their nodes to support that. On mainnet, it started to look like some sort of low percentages, but then it quickly got up to the 60, 70. You know, obviously we want to get to at least 66%, the 2/3. And then people started to sort of breathe a sigh of relief that most people had basically upgraded their nodes and we were in good shape. Cool. All right, going back to the presentation then. Let's talk a little bit about these missed slots, since there was a question about that earlier. So you have a slot that comes in, you fill it with a block, so that's in the previous epoch, and then and now in the current, actually this could be the previous, just the previous slot, but this is at the epic boundary. Then the next slot comes in, you have a block, gets proposed, and things start chugging along, but not all the validators see it. Not everyone sees it. So somebody else, the validator, the proposer for slot 2, doesn't see this. They don't actually, it didn't get to them. So when it's their turn to do a proposal, they think from their perspective that the previous slot was missed, that the current head of the chain is block 111, which is in slot 32. So they will propose block 112 here, but of course it now belongs to slot 2. And then maybe the next validator, the proposer for the next slot, slot 3, they did see the that slot 1, but they haven't seen this one yet. So this is an example where this validator has some kind of latency issue. So not only did they not get this information, they got the older information, but their propagation is slow as well. Not only are they receiving slow, but sending slow, which is typical. Then the next validator is not going to see their slot. And so there's a missed slot there. So now you have 2 missed slots. And at this point, the state A is going to be the heavier chain, if you will, because now you have 2 slots with attestations versus 1 slot with attestations here. So that's probably going to be the one that the fork choice will rule, that Ghost will continue to build off of. So this is sort of a classic example of why you might have missed slots. And at the epic boundary, there's extra work going on. So there's maybe a little bit extra latency that you have to factor in. And so it's actually, there's a sort of a little bit more likelihood that you can have this missed slot situation when you are at the epic boundary. And this was actually a problem that we encountered as a relay operator more than it ought to have occurred. And our team worked pretty closely with the Prism and the Lighthouse teams to try to figure out what's going on and try to improve the processing there so that this sort of epic boundary was handled more efficiently, and therefore to reduce the number of missed slots. And now they're much lower again. So that's sort of a typical thing that can happen. So this is your sort of classic kind of reorg scenario, which is sort of organic to how these algorithms work. But we try to tune the algorithms in order to to minimize it, and we also try to tune our sort of latency setups. So especially with relays, we run pretty highly optimized networks that are distributed around the world with a lot of replication, all that good stuff. Not every validators don't necessarily do that. Some of the larger validator pools might, in order to try to minimize this, because every one of these missed slots you might be losing a half an ETH or an ETH or something like that. It could be a lot of value. Other things can go wrong and have. So in April, we had a pretty interesting event where a validator saw an opportunity to basically fake out the system. And so what they did was they created, sort of a honeypot transactions that were not very good trades on tokens, probably with relatively low liquidity pools, and they basically didn't put any kind of boundary on the slippage for those transactions. And so bots came in and saw that and said, "Oh, I can make $100 or euros here. Oh, I can make 1,000, or I can make 10,000." They just ramped up and said, "Wow, there's like no boundary on this slippage. So I'm going to basically go for everything I possibly could go for." And these bots were about to make an absolute mint off of these transactions. So they just pounced all over that, sandwiched the heck out of it, and were ready to get an absolutely fabulous return that they could close up shop after this, and because they would be making so much money. But they also didn't set any boundaries on how they were sandwiching these transactions. They were trying to get everything they could out of it because they thought someone was being a fool and we're going to take maximum advantage of that. So then when it was time for the block to be proposed, this block with this, these huge sandwich bot transactions in them, the searcher sent those to the builders included them, the relays had them available, and this sort of malicious validator had set it up to when they knew that they would be the proposer, because ahead of time you're a proposer by a few minutes. All the proposers for the epic, that's 6.5 minutes, 6.4 minutes. So you can kind of plan this out carefully when you initiate these honeypot transactions. That's going to trigger the sequence. So the malicious validator then they signed the header that had this juicy block, and but they did it a little bit incorrectly, in a way that they knew that the relays wouldn't check quite right. Because the relays are all open source software, and they could look at that and say, okay, there's a vulnerability there. So they did that. So the relays then, what the relays did was they then, because the block, the bid was signed, they then delivered the block to that validator as they're supposed to. And they did that before actually propagating the block, and therefore verifying that the block, that the signature was okay. And so the signature was not quite okay, so it failed that check, and so it didn't propagate. So now you have a situation where this validator now knows what's inside that block, and it's not propagating yet. So they basically received that invalid block and rewrote it, and basically took out their little honeypot transactions and took these Medbot sandwich attacks and essentially front ran those. And because these were also unbounded, because they were trying to get as much from the zero slippage honeypot transactions, they were able to basically then drain 25 million or so from those bots. And they then propagated that transaction, and because they had baited these Medbots, and since there was no other competing block that was being propagated, that was the winning block. That was the block that ends up going on chain. So they walked away with a lot of money. And needless to say, they were sort of slashed for doing this inappropriate behavior, because technically they violated the consensus rules by signing two distinct blocks. One was invalid, but they signed 2 blocks. That's a breaking of the rules. But the amount of slashing, I mean, even if they were slashed the full 32 ETH, that's that's a low cost for getting 25 million in return. So that's an example of something that can go wrong in a slot under an attack scenario. This attack scenario is no longer available. All the relays have patched this up. They did that within about 12 hours, I think, and as well as a whole number of other fixes to try to improve these kinds of timing attacks. But that is a scenario that can happen. So what happens then when you have these sort of issues with slots? The typical things that you'll get out of that is that a trader can have problems with settlement, which is bad for the trader. A validator is going to have problems with their payout. They're going to miss a slot. They're going to not get the payout that they're expecting. If you're an individual validator, that could be pretty severe because you only maybe get one every 3 months. And so you definitely rely on not having a failure when it's your turn. For larger pools, then they can kind of average that out a bit. Obviously, the builder, if the slot doesn't work, then the builder is going to lose the profits that they would normally get off of building for that particular slot. And then relay operations are affected. I can tell you, from Blocknative's perspective, when these sort of missed slots or other activities happen where a slot is negatively impacted, then we have a lot of sort of operational activity that we have to do to work with the validator to try to understand what happens. Is this a latency issue? Is this a configuration issue on the part of the validator? There's all kinds of reasons why it could happen, and so there's a sort of a human cost to be able to sort of service that. So what have we learned? What relays have learned is that this latency thing is absolutely crucial. So there's a lot of effort to continue to improve the latency game. We're using SSZ, which is sort of a compression algorithm, so that the data being moved around, blocks are really large, is faster. Validators are basically co-locating with relays. That's pretty common practice. Builders are co-locating with relays. That's even more common. And now all the relays will basically, if the relay has access to the block that is being propagated, then they will propagate it as well to try to accelerate that, to prevent any kind of timing games and reduce any kind of orphaning of slot, these orphan or missed slots. And then MEV-Boost has been updated to further improve any kind of latency issues. Remember that MEV-Boost has this sort of interesting property where they call this, they have a function that calls to get the bid, but anybody can do that. And that's an unsigned request. So relays basically are serving bid requests from a lot of people, from builders, from validators, from everyone. So there's also sort of a latency issue there because they're serving, probably thousands of get header requests per second. And then there's some discussion about having, sort of delaying the get header and the get payload, so that it kind of reduces the chance for the validator from sort of stealing a block, from getting the payload and doing something with it before the get header, the signing of that get header is really started to propagate. And of course, as I mentioned, builders are co-locating and using compression. Right, but there's still a ton of work to do in ePBS, and sort of watch this page because there's a lot to do there. And ePBS, enshrined PBS, is where we don't necessarily need to use relays, and it's not clear how long that's going to take. It's probably a few years, if ever, actually. So there's a lot of experimenting being done there. Builders having to stake so that they can't build blocks that can't be properly verified. All kinds of sort of proposals that are out there, some of them being experimented with on relays. In fact, the relay community is sort of like the ePBS or enshrined PBS testbed that we have. And then in the future, there's going to be single slot finality. That creates some interesting problems. I mentioned at the very beginning that you have these committees of 128 validators. If you're going to do single slot finality, you need to have way more validators on that slot. That creates a whole host of new problems, including new latency issues. So that's if you can get all validators to basically validate a slot, then you can do single slot finality. But that's a pretty serious bandwidth issue. And then on the execution layer, you have danksharding, proto-danksharding, which is going to change some of the dynamics, especially on the bandwidth side as well. So builders getting it to relays, relays getting it to validators, that changes the latency game. And then a lot of work being done by various entities in pre-confirmation, since you know the proposer that is theoretically going to sort of own the slot, then there may be some interesting pre-confirmation possibilities there. And yeah, so that's pretty much it for this presentation. Blocknative is very involved in this as a builder, as a relay. We also have numerous other products as indicated on this slide. We're basically a core infrastructure provider for Ethereum and get involved in pretty much all of the sort of base layer protocols, as well as more and more protocols on top of that, like 4337 and L2s and things like that. And there's only a few minutes left, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the short time.
Thanks, Chris. That was awesome. And I know I learned a lot, so I'm sure everyone else did too. We got a lot of questions, so I will try to go through them in order. So first is there a point or a set number of slots after which a transaction paying low gas fees may eventually be dropped, as MEV will continually choose the most profitable block?
Yeah, there's sort of. So this predates, this has nothing to do with MEV. This has nothing to do with proof of stake or the merge or anything like that. This predates that if you're in the public mempool and you're sitting there for the standard configuration in Geth is if you're sitting there for 3 hours and it hasn't been rebroadcast by anybody else, you might get dropped. So the public mempool is interesting. It basically, think of it like a pool, right? And it's only the very top of the pool that is sort of marketable. They have enough gas that people might include them, whether they're including them directly in a block or maybe they're being included indirectly via a bundle because of some kind of MEV activity. And if you're below a certain point, then you just get ejected out of there. And most people run sort of a stock Geth with about 4,000 transactions in the mempool. And this became more complicated earlier last year because of the introduction of sort of the new base fee gas mechanism, 1557. And so now there's actually a very literal floor to how much gas you have to be even possible to be included. And it's independent of a particular Geth node. It's just based on the previous block. So if you get kicked out because your gas is too low and the node hasn't seen it for around 3 hours, it just basically just ignores you at that point. Now, not all nodes work that way. There are some nodes, like nodes that Blocknative operates, as well as nodes that other block explorers operate, where they keep like an infinite mempool. So the mempool, is like 250, 300,000 transactions in it. But most, there's transactions in there that have been there for months. There might even be transactions that have been there for a year. I'm not sure. So it is possible to keep them around, but it's unlikely that they will sort of ever be processed. Hope that answered the questions.
Awesome. And then last question, is there any timing stats on when a block is chosen within the 12 seconds?
Is there any, can you repeat that?
Any timing / stats on when a block is chosen within the 12 seconds?
Yeah, I think that if you look at the chart here, you can see that this is the proposed block. So you can see that it sort of distributes around the beginning of the next slot, the block for the previous slot. Plus or minus 2 seconds from that. And so this is sort of the proposal time. So if you're to the left of this, that means that you're worried about propagation issues and you want to make sure that you don't miss the slot. And if you're on the right of that, then that means you believe that you have good latency or you are greedy for more valuable blocks. So you're willing to take the chance.
Amazing. I know that there were more questions. So if you do have more questions, hop on our Discord. You can access that through our website, blocknative.com. And Chris, thank you so much again for all of your valuable insight. And we'll be sure to have you back on a webinar soon.
Cool. Thank you very much. I enjoyed that. Hope that was helpful for everyone.